Hola a todos, mi nombre es Cristal y soy parte de la colectiva de justicia del lenguaje Comal y soy una de las intérpretes de hoy. Estoy aquí con mi co-intérprete DJ.
Hello, everyone. My name is DJ, and I'm with the Language Justice Collective Comal, and I'm one of the interpreters today, and I'm here with my co-interpreter, Cristal.
Primero que nada, quiero agradecer a Texas Appleseed por priorizar la justicia del lenguaje.
First, we want to thank Texas Appleseed for prioritizing language justice.
La justicia del lenguaje es el derecho a participar plenamente con el idioma que la persona se sienta más cómoda. Nosotros creemos que la justicia del lenguaje se puede alcanzar a través de solidaridad significativa que trasciende las barreras lingüísticas.
Language justice is the right to participate fully in the language a person feels most comfortable. We believe that justice can be achieved through meaningful solidarity that transcends language barriers.
Entonces, cuando la interpretación se haga disponible, podrán ver el globo terráqueo y podrán ver el lenguaje el cual quieran participar, o si están en su celular, en la aplicación podrán hacerlo al hacer clic en los tres puntitos. Si no quieren escuchar el audio original, pueden apagarlo.
So when the interpretation is enabled, you will see a globe where you can choose the language you want to participate in. Or if you're using the app on your phone, you can do so by clicking the three dots. If you do not want to hear the original audio, you may turn it off.
Finalmente, si tienen algún problema con la interpretación, por favor de comunicarse por el chat o simplemente digan algo y no sufran en silencio. Queremos que todos puedan participar de manera plena.
Finally, if you have any problems with the interpretation, please communicate in the chat or say something. Please do not suffer in silence. We want everyone to participate fully.
Muchas gracias, eso es todo. Pueden ya encender la función de interpretación y dar unos cuantos segundos para que todos puedan encontrar el botón y elegir el idioma en el que quieran participar.
Thank you very much. That is all. You may now turn on the interpretation function. Please give everyone a few seconds to find the button and choose the language they want to participate in.
Thank you so much, DJ and Cristal. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining our second installment of the legislative webinar series. During this unprecedented and unique legislative session, we wanted to be very thoughtful at Texas Appleseed of how we engaged in the process and engaged the public, and wanted to bring about experts and advocates in our various program areas to really explain what's going on at the legislature this session and talk about how the community can get involved even as the coronavirus pandemic continues. My name is Andrew Hairston. I direct the Education Justice Project at Texas Appleseed. Texas Appleseed is a public interest justice center based in Austin, although we work across the state to really dismantle unjust laws and policies that burden historically underserved Texans. In our education justice work, we focus a great deal on ending the school to prison pipeline, as well as ensuring equal educational opportunities for all young people across Texas enrolled in their K through 12 education. I am so honored to be joined by two brilliant advocates in this space today, and we're going to have a very robust discussion. First, Amber Watts from the Austin Justice Coalition, and she'll share more about herself. And then Alicia Castillo from the Texas Criminal Justice Coalition as well. She'll share more very soon here. But at this point, I'm just excited to get into the conversation with our speakers today, and they can join me.
Hi, Andrew. So happy to be here.
Hey, y'all.
Hey, y'all. Happy to be here as well.
It's so good to see y'all. Thank you for joining us. So I'd like to start just with some background. If y'all could introduce yourselves, kind of tell folks how you got involved in the fight for education justice.
My name is Amber Watts, and I got involved in the fight for education justice, it kind of came out of just a need that I had myself as a young Black girl in the school system. I didn't have a good experience myself, didn't have a teacher or a coach, that classic story where someone takes interest in you and they mentor you. Well, no one ever took interest in me as a Black girl in the school system. And that affected my education. That affected how I saw myself and how I moved in life. And when I got older, when I realized this, I realized the importance of education justice and started doing this work because every child deserves to be valued and seen and heard.
Hey y'all, I'm Alicia Castillo. My pronouns are she and her. And I got involved in this work, I think, similarly, like out of this my own acknowledgement of the lack that existed in my experience, but also from the gaping lack that I saw when I worked as an educator with students with disabilities. And day after day, I saw how kind of traditional school settings often disenfranchise them further than our culture and communities already did. And as I started to step into the world of public policy, I really, I started my journey in like the adult justice world, but then I just kept being drawn back to like, what about those kids and like where it started. And so from there, I was able to kind of transition and start to really focus on youth justice policy, which is the project that I lead at Texas Criminal Justice Coalition. And our coalition is really centered around providing the education and the data and then the policy recommendations that are needed to, yes, dismantle the systems that have been historically acting as tools of oppression towards underserved communities, but also to create smart and safe solutions to social issues in our communities. So that's me. I'll pass it back to you, Andrew.
Thank you both so much for those searing reflections. They really demonstrate how the personal is political. One thing in my introductory remarks that I mentioned is the school to prison pipeline. And just to provide background and context, we define it often at Texas Appleseed and in our coalition spaces as a racist and oppressive system that disproportionately burdens historically underserved young people, Black and brown children, LGBTQ young people, kids with disabilities, and really pushes them out of their classrooms for routine, age-appropriate behavior and into contact with the criminal legal system. We have seen that system operate in two primary ways: through exclusionary discipline, which can be placements in alternative education, suspensions, and expulsions, among other things, and the increase in school policing, especially over the past 50 years, where so many young people enter into these spaces where they are criminalized every day in their education, and they are made to feel like they don't belong, as Amber so eloquently put, and Alicia. So, for important grounding, I just wanted to share that definition and offer that up as we continue our conversation. So, y'all, we're here, and these crises have all come together. We have the coronavirus pandemic. We have the largest social movements, maybe in American history, after the police murders of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and others. And we have the fallout from all of that, the economic suffering that a lot of people have gone through that have led to the 87th legislative session that's going on right now. So kind of with all of that in mind, would you all reflect on where your organizations are in terms of legislative priorities and how you're navigating this very unique legislative session?
Sure. You bring up a great point about this past year. We historically have been kind of beating the drum on some of these issues at TCJC, and we had to really shift our thinking in March of 2020 about how we were going to address these issues. And at that time, I would say about a month into the COVID pandemic, our senior policy analyst brought up that, wow, we haven't had rush hour traffic in a month. I don't know when we'll have it again. What does that mean for like the economic state of Texas, with oil and gas being such a huge portion of our revenue? And from there, we started to anticipate, this all of these crises in all these many different ways, but really this bleeding into this legislative session and potentially the next one, as we consider what the budget implications are. Texas is already a somewhat difficult state to fight for investments in social justice issues. And we knew that it was going to be a little bit more difficult this session. So we decided to take all of our policy priorities and shift them to this framework of what does it mean for Texas to spend our values. If we say we care about children and families, if we say that we care about employment and thriving communities, what does that look like in dollars and cents? And as that related to our youth justice work, which is mostly focused on youth decarceration and education justice and how they intersect, we found that, gosh, it's incredible the amount of money that we spend to do things that ultimately end up putting children and their families in a worse position. What would it look like for us to kind of divest from the way that we've always done things in this moment of crisis and invest in real solutions? So in this moment, we have all these policy priorities that are laid out in bills, but we're also for the first time looking at really closely at advocacy through the lens of the Texas budget, and looking at what we can do with dollars that already exist and how we can maybe allocate those to areas that will promote all these policies that we're fighting for. So that's where we're at right now, and I'm excited to see how it all pans out throughout the rest of the session.
Alicia, I really appreciate what you said. It made me think about this statement where someone calls using a budget as a, a moral document. It's so true, and it just popped in my head. But as an organization with Austin Justice Coalition, we've been working with Lege for about the past 4 years or so. And in about the past year and a half, we have started with education justice. And so being kind of the new kids on the block in Austin doing this work, our focus has been on decreasing the funding dedicated to school resource officers and increasing the funding that's invested in students' well-being, whether that be restorative practices or mental health services. And so we've done that. We've been doing this work so far by engaging with some other organizations such as TCJC and Texas Appleseed and Excellence and Advancement Foundation to kind of learn what has been done and where we've been as a city and where we're headed, and how we as Austin Justice Coalition can contribute to the work that's being done. So that's kind of where we are. We're new and learning in education justice and contributing in as many ways as we can.
Amber, I'm so glad that you mentioned restorative practices, and would love, if you're feeling so, to reflect more on what restorative practices mean, especially in this work, and how they really show up in a practical way in school districts in 2021.
Of course. So we're hoping that restorative practices, as an organization, we hope that it can possibly become the sole system of responding to behavior. Sorry about that noise. Responding to behavior within Austin ISD. And restorative practices is a 3-tiered system that is based in community building and relationship building. And then you kind of move into relationship mending. And then when you get to the point, and hopefully you don't, but the point where schools are doing like exclusionary discipline, then it's reentry and healing from that, excuse me, from that point. So you're bringing reentry circles, you're bringing students back into the fold, you're rebuilding and mending and healing those relationships so that they can be successful academically and socially. And so with restorative practices within AISD, currently it is officially in 10, it's grant funded and on 10 campuses. And it is recently been rolled out to a high school campus. So 11 campuses. The campuses, there are 6 elementary schools that are involved and 4 middle schools. And like I said, recently we added a high school to this group of schools. And what it looks like right now is creating buy-in, which means like getting it so that getting to a point where the leadership and the teachers want restorative practices on their campus, understand what restorative practices is, have a common language around what we're doing and why we're doing this, why it's necessary, and then are able to implement restorative practices on their campuses, which looks like building relationship, like I said, and then being able to restore, because you can't restore something you haven't built, that relationship once a harm has occurred. I hope that helps.
That's super important grounding. And I think it's very helpful for us to especially think about how all of us in our organizations are framing our recommendations for what the world can look like, right? I think a very important thing for me, as I've thought about this work and proceeded through my career, is this notion of prison industrial complex abolition, which most broadly can be defined as taking away those investments from what I frankly call death-making institutions of policing, prisons, and surveillance, and investing that money in life-affirming resources for communities that have so long been denied to them, such as education, arts, housing, healthcare, right? And that philosophy of restorative practices, I think, really illustrates how we move the needle on that in the fight to dismantle the school to prison pipeline, and reflects what we can really achieve in the years to come, right, as we recover from the coronavirus pandemic and so much else. And so, in that point, I just want to kind of open it up for reflections to y'all on this notion of abolition, how it plays into the fight to dismantle the school to prison pipeline. We're all members of a coalition convened by the Austin Justice Coalition called Bettering Austin School System, or BAS, that's really focused on that divestment from school policing in Austin ISD, as Amber said. And so, yeah, I'd love to hear your reflections, especially after this past year of so much momentum and advocacy in this front.
Amber, I was going to defer to you just because you have been you were one of the key founders of this group. And I've been so impressed over the past year just to sit in those spaces and learn from you and the rest of the AJC team.
I appreciate that. And I've learned so much from all of you that have been a part of this group. And with this work, I'm sorry, I just drew a blank. So I was just like, with this work, we have been working to divest from police, as Andrew said, to get Austin ISD to see how policing is harming our Black and Brown students, to understand in the way that it's currently being done and understand kind of the why. And so some of our work has been capacity building, and a lot of it at this moment is capacity building, where we're teaching about the history of SROs, or school resource officers, in our nation and then locally. And then we're moving into the history of it, not just in Austin, but then in AISD. And so that's been a key part of our campaign so far, is to first learn so that we can move and create a way of being that includes divesting from police, but is responsive to who we are as a school district. And it's really important that we are being culturally responsive in this, because if we aren't paying attention to what we need as a district and what our students and families and admin and staff need, then we're not going to be able to create something that works for us, that does not include school resource officers. And so a lot of research is taking place at this point, a lot of partnerships and capacity building.
And it's been beautiful. And oh my gosh, it's only going to get better from here. Yeah, and it's been really interesting to be part of a group that is so aligned with some of these things that are really just their values. And I think what we've all identified is that in our school system, like across the nation, this is the key challenge, is that we have this misalignment of values. Discipline in schools is based on, in fact, in Texas, the discipline part of the education code is really based on the penal code. We've just grown to accept as a culture that wrongdoing must be handled with retribution, with punishment. And fortunately, that's not how children learn. Anyone who has children, anyone who's worked with children knows that the way that we deal with conflict in adults is very different than the way we deal with conflict with children. And so what I've seen come out of this group and out of other groups that are really focused on adopting a new culture of restorative responses that are rooted in interconnectedness and in growing and in learning, is that I also just drew a blank, but what I really noticed is that we are willing to talk about like what it would look like to turn into these institutions into places that truly do provide age appropriate, like individual educational opportunities for children. Because when we talk about restorative practices, certainly they're a response, right, to these behaviors or to wrongdoing, but they're also part of the social emotional learning components of education. A child does not come out of the womb knowing how to handle conflict, and the tools that our bodies use for that naturally, instinctively, are often ones that we have to, mold into better instincts. And so when we discuss this with teachers and administrators, I think one of our primary challenges is how can we look at restorative justice not as like a new method that you have to add to your curriculum. You've already got your like procedures in books that are this big. Okay, great, there's another chapter. No, we're trying to say, how can we turn this whole system, this institution, this school, this administration, this staff, this body of students into one that adopts an entirely new way of being. And that's hard work. So
thank y'all so much. I'm the son of a Baptist minister, and he would tell me, along with church elders, to take your time. So y'all just continue taking your time. Y'all are offering so many wonderful gems right now that are super instructive. One reason that I really wanted to highlight our work with Bass is because at Texas Appleseed, and I think a number of our sister organizations, we have recognized that the needle often moves in these fights from the local to the statewide. I think about advocacy that we engaged in some years ago concerning suspensions for the youngest Texans, the pre-K through 2 suspension ban that was first entertained by local school districts. Granted, they were the big school districts in Texas, like Austin, Dallas, and Houston, but the advocacy at that local level led to a statewide change to a bill being passed in 2017 that banned suspensions for pre-K through 2 students across Texas. So, especially in this fight to really dismantle the school to prison pipeline once and for all, and to really capitalize on the momentum that we've experienced over the past year, where we've had dozens of school districts across the country, especially after the police murder of George Floyd, from Minneapolis itself, where he lived, to Oakland, California, either vote to disband their internal school police departments or to end the contracts between the school districts and the local police departments where they lie. And so this is, I think, really important for us to think about, even in this session where a lot is focused on the coronavirus pandemic and its impact on Texas public policy, but to think about that model of coalitions like BAS, right? As we think about the long game over the next 5 to 10 years, even the next 15 to 25 years, the fight for what we often call it police-free schools, I think will be won in that way through these local fights across Texas, across the South, across the nation. Okay? So I super appreciate your reflections. One other thing before I go into a specific question about how education justice bills have fared this session is a point that both of our speakers have made about the relationships required under restorative justice and restorative practices, right? One thing that I often say as I engage in public facing speaking opportunities in this front is to reflect on our education system in America as it exists. This is something that has been built for decades, in certain instances, centuries, under the idea that Black and brown children especially need to be brought to heel, need to be controlled, need to be tamed. It is going to take more than a single, even multi-million-dollar budget item to really address the centuries-long philosophy that has informed American education in the K through 12 space. And so this is something that I really try, and I think all of our organizations try to emphasize when we are speaking with legislators and policymakers, that you have to trust, especially after the year that we've all endured, that the investments that you are making in these practices, in restorative practices, might not have the immediate turnaround that you're expecting. But if you stick with it, if you really invest in this philosophy across your district and your community, you will see perhaps generations down the road the positive impact of this. And it feels like an injustice of our work of education justice advocacy that our kids are aging out as we're doing this. But that's a really important thing for me that I try to talk about often, right? Those investments that are necessary and the relationships that will carry them. So I just want to thank y'all again for your reflections. So with that in mind, I will ask that question from your perspectives. How have education justice bills done at the legislature so far, and what can we expect over the next 2 months of session?
So it's been a challenge. And I think you've highlighted what the challenge is, right? That this is not an overnight fix. I think what a lot of practitioners and folks who are steeped in restorative practices, one of the resources we lean on a lot is like the little book of restorative justice or restorative justice in education from Howard Zur. And all of these practices are obviously drawn from, other cultures, the Maori tribes in now New Zealand, indigenous folks from here, and the constant theme that I think that we've seen that Howard highlights is that we can picture these practices and this theory really in practice as like a flower. There's just this time where the seed is in the ground and these roots are growing that you don't see at all, but that are completely necessary in order for the flower to bloom. And so that's a really simple illustration, but I just think that the point of like the seed being nourished and doing that work under the ground is really difficult. I mean, it's a dark place, like in the analogy and in practice, where schools have like these growing pains of, implementing these new policies and making mistakes and learning from them, sometimes for years. I've heard from many practitioners that it takes about 6 or 7 years before restorative practices are, fully operating the way that they're intended throughout an entire school. And that's a long time to have to deal with, like, stumbling through a new way of being. So that being said, at the Texas legislature, I think there has been a little bit of just this hesitancy. Like, we already struggle in schools with what we have, the limited resources we have. We know there aren't enough counselors. We know there aren't enough, the counselors that there aren't counseling. They have to be like these academic coaches, right? So we know those challenges exist. And so asking us to do something new is just, we're not ready for it. But I think the conversation has really been begun in the past few years. And now we're at a place, I think, with this national reckoning of like, the results of continuing to invest in oppressive systems. We're ready to maybe start reimagining what all these systems can look like. And so as far as this session goes, lots of great bills have been introduced for education justice. Unfortunately, the big one that has gotten airtime has been one that is actually really bad and we talk about it in education justice because it actively works against everything we're doing. So we're caught off guard and have to play like defense on some of the bills that are coming up. And so that one has gotten a lot of airtime, but there was a lot of response, and I don't know that it's going anywhere. And so now we're just kind of in waiting and advocating for those good bills to be heard. And then again, doing that kind of side quiet work of working on the budget to make sure that those things are implemented regardless of what happens with the bills.
I don't have much to add to that because similarly, Austin Justice Coalition is in a very similar position. But I do have actually the active knowledge of and experience of implementing restorative practices in schools and being in year 3.5 on a quest for the schools to adopt tier 1 of restorative practices. It's quite a journey. And it just you're right, it creates a lot of hesitancy, even once you're 3.5 years in, where there was originally buy-in, and now it's like, oh no, this is taking too long, I'm done. And so that also, what you were saying, Alicia, reminded me that it also creates hesitancy to support bills that are pushing for restorative practices, because being 3.5 years in experience, you feel like it's not working. And so it's a hard job to do, and it's a hard thing to sell, so to speak, because of the time, that dark period. But it is something that has been proven to work. And so that was the only thing I wanted to add to that, is that it does work and it takes time, and it's happening in a small way within the district.
I so greatly appreciate y'all. At this point, we can bring our slide deck back and talk about some of the ways that the community can engage. Right. So we'll talk about, I think, what Alicia was alluding to, this bad bill that we've been fighting for the past few weeks. But there are a few ways to engage, and I'll invite my co-panelists to speak at any time. So you can write to your representatives during this session. We'll include some resources here where you can look at the frequently asked questions on the Capitol website, and they will have tools for you to identify, perhaps based on your zip code, who represents you in the Texas House and the Texas Senate, and you can write to them accordingly. You can testify or offer public comment. Alicia has been diligent and tireless in her efforts this session to really make sure that community voices are heard, both from the TCJC perspective and from the folks they work with. So we'll talk about that and what that looks like if you're comfortable. And I also just wanted to reflect on the formal Texas Appleseed education justice priorities for this session. This is how we have really determined whether or not to be in a defensive posture or an offensive posture based on a particular bill. Our priorities for this session are ending exclusionary discipline. As I mentioned, these are practices that keep kids out of the classroom. Alternative education, suspensions, expulsions. You also have something called JJAEP placements, juvenile justice alternative education programs. We also want to reduce reliance on and the funding to school policing, right? Because of the conversation we've had today and what we have seen in our advocacy, we recognize that school police don't equate to school safety. And conversely, school police often make historically underserved young people feel much less safe in their school environments and lead to many physical and psychological harms for them. And our final priority is prioritizing equitable relief from the coronavirus pandemic. One thing that we didn't discuss as much during the discussion just now was the digital divide and how the lack of internet access for a lot of folks across the country, maybe like 20% of the country doesn't have reliable broadband access, has impacted how folks have experienced the coronavirus pandemic. So as schools are continually thinking about reopening plans, as the vaccine is rolled out for more folks, we want to think about what are the bills that will secure better internet access for Texas families and make sure that as they are going back into their schools, they have the resources available to them that will lead to restorative practices and other forms of restorative justice. We can go to the next slide. Alicia, I'd love if you'd like to reflect on what it's like to be at the Capitol since you've been there pretty frequently this session.
Sure. You know, I'll just at the outset, I'll say it's not as scary as I thought it was going to be. I, initially was very hesitant to go, but I think there have been um, the Capitol staff, incredible people, mostly young students themselves, are doing just a phenomenal job. And so, just for a quick kind of like walkthrough, once you arrive at the Capitol, there is a place to get a free rapid COVID test. So you'll want to show up a little bit early ahead of the hearing that you're waiting for to get that done. It takes about 15 minutes. Then they give you a wristband that indicates you're negative if you are indeed negative, and that'll allow you into a hearing room. In the hearing rooms, masks are required. Though throughout the building, I think you'll see most people are still wearing masks despite the mandate being lifted. So that's a comfort. And in the hearing room, there are little dividers for each chair, so people won't have to be packed in like sardines as much as usual. And then the staff again has been really great about setting up overflow rooms as well. So the protocol, yeah, other than that has been pretty business as usual. I will say that the staff during this time, staff of legislators are so incredibly busy and are overworked and tired. And I do know that as far as, is it worth it to go in? I think I would typically say, yeah, it is if it's safe for you, right? Just because, if you're masked up, especially if you're vaccinated, it's a little bit easier to communicate, right then and there than it is to get someone to read your email or to access your house comments, whatever it is. Though those are absolutely worth doing as well. So that's a little bit of it. Did I cover everything, Andrew?
You did. That was incredibly helpful. And just for cognizance of the language, justice, access, I appreciate this reminder. Just reflecting on what appears on this slide deck is that, as Alicia said, members of the public can testify on bills in person at the Capitol. As she said, there are various practices in place to ensure that as you go into the Capitol, CDC recommendations can be honored, such as social distancing and wearing masks. And as the vaccine rollout continues across the country, with eligibility opening up for the vaccine for all adults on Monday in Texas, this will, we're super excited for that. This will, make in-person testimony, I think, that much more feasible. Again, even as the vaccine continues to roll out, we recognize that it's a deeply personal decision to go to the Capitol during a pandemic. So if you are not comfortable going, that is completely understandable. And there are other ways to engage. If you do testify, you will have to register as a witness. We have included a link in the slide deck, and we'll try to share that after the webinar. But it's a touchless system where you might use an iPad to enter your information when you appear at the Capitol and then choose to testify in front of a committee. If you are not comfortable, there are ways to still engage with the process, which we'll talk about in a specific way very soon, that include writing testimony or a public comment on a bill and submitting it electronically, right? Emailing it to staffers at the Capitol or submitting it to the committee, the Public Education Committee in the House side, the Senate Education Committee, probably for education justice bills. But with that process, it might not appear on the record depending on how you transmit it. So again, we'll discuss more of what your options look like to officially appear on the record, either for or against certain bills. We can go to the next slide. So Alicia teed us up for this, right? There's an awful bill that was moving through the process very frequently, very recently, pardon me. And Alicia, if you'd like to reflect on HB 759, feel free. I'm also happy to, wherever you choose.
Sure. Yeah, this was interesting. This bill and something we've been trying to do is acknowledge the intent, but honor the impact. I heard that from Lauren Ortel the other day with Indivisible Texas, and so the author, says the intent of the bill, which is a bill that creates a database of threat assessment kids that have been referred under a threat assessment that the school does. It would essentially be like a tracking database of kids who have either threatened to bully, threatened to harm themselves, whatever the threats are really discretionary. So it's a lot of students that could end up on this database until they're 21 years old. We've seen similar databases play out in other ways, such as gang databases, and every time they disproportionately negatively impact kids of color and kids with disabilities, and often kids in the foster care system. There are ways to go about tracking how we ensure services are provided to kids who are in danger or are at risk for harming others without necessarily putting them in a database that will ultimately potentially criminalize them until they're 21. Just for further reference, even the juvenile justice system, if a child does commit an offense, their record would be sealed as soon as they're done with that. So at the age of 17 or 18, that would no longer follow them. So having this additional database follow them until they're 21 doesn't even align with what we're doing in the juvenile justice system. So it's a no from me on that one.
Thank you so much, Alicia. And one thing about this that is very problematic for us is that it mirrors the practice of gang databases in so many spaces across the country. You might think of large cities like New York City or Los Angeles, where the school police departments will cooperate with local law enforcement agencies and have a gang database of young people who haven't been accused of doing anything wrong, but just simply because of their affiliations or their social network, this is something that is leading to them being surveilled and monitored, right? And so we think that this bill would operate in a very similar way to really hone in on young people who have not done anything wrong, right? And especially in this time of virtual learning or hybrid learning, are just trying to navigate this really uncharted territory like the rest of us, being in this virtual setting, going to school online, right? And these young people should not have the fear that what they say on social media or what they're saying to each other, maybe very often in jest, will lead to some type of formal threat assessment process, and then a database marking that will stay with them until they're 21 years old, right? So again, I think that goes to the second priority that we have at Texas Appleseed of really reducing reliance on school policing and surveillance and making sure that investments are prioritized for actually beneficial resources for young people. The bill right now is currently pending. It's left pending in the House Public Education Committee. We've included a link on the slide deck of you being able to access where the bill is, HB 759. So kind of keep your eyes out for that in the coming weeks. Now, we also want to uplift a bill, HB 62, right? So to kind of provide that perspective of what you can oppose in the session, but also what you can support. And Amber and Alicia, feel free to jump in at any point. But this has been introduced by James Talarico, and it would create a restorative justice coordinating council in school districts across the state. And I think this reflects a lot of our organizational priorities in the fight for education justice and in the fight to dismantle the school to prison pipeline, that a council at the district level would have the authority to really emphasize the restorative practices that we discussed today, and really push the district to invest in those resources that would offer really material support to young people, especially as they come back to school fully as the coronavirus pandemic grows closer to its end. And this is a reflection, I think, for us on what districts in Texas need to be doing, how the needle can be moved to really get to the end of the school to prison pipeline once and for all. Do y'all want to reflect on that, Amber and Alicia?
I'll just add one great feature of the bill is that, currently school districts have the option to adopt restorative alternatives to their traditional discipline policies. This bill would direct every district to create a restorative justice policy, those practices in their district. And then it would also, and this is due to the work of the community members that we've spoken with, and due to the work of those advocates who are just deeply entrenched in this work, the bill now in a committee substitute will have new language that includes the provision that districts must use those policies prior to engaging in sort of any exclusionary action for a child, so long as the child chooses to engage with it. Because one of the functions of restorative justice that we like to highlight is that it's completely voluntary. And so if the child isn't interested, they're not going to be forced, or we're not going to, a school wouldn't, dehumanize them in a sense by forcing them to engage in that. So it's one I'm excited about. And Amber, I would love to hear your perspective on it.
My biggest reflection on the bill is that it uses restorative values. It amplifies them. It, like, for example, what you're pointing out, Alicia, where it's like the child isn't forced, and understanding that that's, that would be against what restorative practices actually is in practice. And I love that this bill actually is grounded and rooted in the values of restorative practices and restorative justice in that way. And having a restorative justice coordinating council at the district level would be super helpful in schools as a model of how to implement restorative practices and restorative justice, and a council similar to that on their campuses, to then start to implement the practices, the ongoing cultural shifts that's required to implement restorative practices and justice on their school campus.
So grateful for these reflections. So this bill, unlike 759, is currently referred to the House Public Education Committee. So it has not been through any committee hearings as of yet. There's still hope that it may, but again, we've included the webpage for that bill, HB 62, where you can check on the Capitol website of where it is and how it proceeds for the rest of session. Before we go into the question and answer portion, I just wanted to offer up some resources from our organizations. I wanted to refer everyone to our individual organizational websites. Austin Justice Coalition has done a wonderful job, as Amber said, of illustrating the history of school police officers, both nationally, with the first ones appearing in Flint, Michigan 70 years ago, to the history of Austin Independent School District and the school resource officers there. And you can find that on their education website. austinjustice.org/education. The Texas Criminal Justice Coalition, as Alicia stated, has been really instrumental in fighting for youth justice and for restorative justice practices at the local and state levels across Texas. And we have included a link to their website where you can learn more about their restorative justice practices work. You can refer to the Texas Appleseed Education Justice Project's website, texasappleseed.org/education justice, as appears on the slide deck. And then one thing that has been highly instructive for me as we talk about linking the fight for prison industrial complex abolition to the fight to end the school to prison pipeline is a report that I worked on at a previous job in DC. This was a report published by Advancement Projects National Office, my former employer, and the Alliance for Educational Justice, which is a coalition of grassroots organizations across the United States, really across the United States and Canada at this point. And we came to learn.com is the link where you can find that report that calls for police-free schools. This report was published in August of 2018, and I think it's been a really seminal text over the past few years in understanding how we got here with the tens of thousands of school police officers in districts across the country to how we get them out, right? And we're really excited to share with folks. Please, stay tuned on our social media channels at Texas Appleseed for an examination of how the coronavirus pandemic has impacted the whole child in Texas, right? From their education to food instability that a lot of folks have faced, to housing insecurity. That report is called Education Transformed, the K through 12 experience in Texas during the coronavirus pandemic, that we hope to release finally next week, that we're on track to release. In that first slide where we talked about legislative advocacy, here are some links from the Texas legislature that you can access. One is a frequently asked questions page about finding your representative. And then the other is the witness requirement if you want to appear in person and testify. And so we've included those links as well. And I think at this point, we will go to the Q&A. So one question was asked in the Q&A feature on Zoom that Texas is the prime example of show me your budget and I will tell you what you value. Our state is failing our most marginalized communities. We don't invest enough in prevention and restorative practices. Do you have examples of how you've used budget writers to address key justice initiatives? I'll just open that up.
I do have one example. So last session, out of a tragedy that occurred in Santa Fe, Texas, a school shooting, the legislature did respond to that by creating a number of reforms, one of them being SB 11 that included a school safety allotment. And this was about $100 million, if I'm not incorrect, that would go to schools for four things: more security, more surveillance, and then mental health and positive school climate supports. This session, we have a new crisis. So through this rider that we're working on, we're asking for that allotment to go completely to those things that will serve this crisis, move away completely from those hardening measures, and move change the language so that it all goes to those supports. So that is a rider on the school safety allotment, and that's just one example.
Thank you for that so much, Alicia. And I do just want to ground us in the horrific acts of mass violence that we've had to endure over the past 2 weeks. First in Atlanta with a number of Asian folks who were murdered, and now from Boulder, Colorado, this mass shooting at a grocery store. And that community violence and school violence will often converge to lead to policymakers call for more policing, more surveillance, more investments in the prison industrial complex. And that is something that we have had to be very vigilant in opposing, especially after those incidents of mass violence in schools in 2018 in Parkland, in Santa Fe, right? That led to what Alicia just described, the SB 11 model of either invest the money in mental health resources or more likely invest the money in policing and surveillance, right? And so we just have to be hyper vigilant about continuing to oppose that narrative that we need more policing in our schools or our communities after acts of mass violence, right? Both the data and the stories from folks often confirm that, you know, after acts of mass violence, the push to increase policing will only tend to harm those historically underserved groups of people that we've discussed, right? Black and brown folks, LGBTQ folks, folks with disabilities, right? So that's just something I wanted to offer up. I think that might have been the only question that we had. Alicia and Amber, do you all have any final reflections before I go into my notes of gratitude?
Just so grateful to have shared this time with you, and to get to work alongside you on so many of these important measures.
I was actually going to share the same gratitude for you, Andrew, and also you, Alicia, and being able to work with you and learn from both of you. And it's been a beautiful experience. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you both. It looks like we might have a question on Facebook, so I'm gonna go there real quickly and look to see what folks may have asked there. Give me 1 second. Okay, I'll switch between my laptop. So on Facebook, we have a question of how successful or unsuccessful has it been to get rid of police in schools here in Texas? This is such a good question. What is the current view from many school boards and administrators in school districts like Houston, ISD, and others about making this change? I have a lot of thoughts on this, but do y'all want to share? Any thoughts you have? Well, I'll start, right, and folks feel free to jump in. So I've been thinking about this for a long time. So I might not have shared that I'm a lawyer by trade, and I've been a lawyer for 5 years. And so I started my career in DC and was thinking about, as I engaged with 2 national racial justice organizations, how do we honor the calls of local community organizations that are against criminalization, that are for ending the school to prison pipeline, that are against school policing, right, in a way that reflects a symbiotic relationship, right? So I've tried to be very thoughtful about being what's called a movement lawyer, right? And engage with directly impacted groups and community organizations in a way that honors their calls, right? Recognizing that directly impacted folks, parents and young people, will really actualize the theory that folks are talking about more quickly than the policies will change to reflect that, right? So, and to phrase that another way, folks have been calling for police-free schools for a long time, right? Parents and young people across the country. And, you know, I'm grateful for the past 5 years to have, you know, refined that politic more and to be unapologetic in calling for that alongside with parents and young people. But we do recognize that Texas is a unique political consideration, right? Kind of in the heart of the South, right, in its own unique culture, right? That, you know, we love, right? We're in Texas, right? We work for Texas organizations. But I think that all of us can acknowledge that this is a fight for the long haul in Texas, that especially in those large districts, there is going to be a lot of pushback from a number of stakeholders on getting police out of schools. You have the internal school police departments themselves, you have the unions that represent them, you have community members who are like, well, what does that mean for safety, right? What about school shootings? Which, you know, we can debunk and say school police are often ineffective in preventing acts of mass violence in schools. So I think we're all buckling in for the long haul in this, and we'll continue to do our local advocacy, be in coalition with one another locally, fight for it that way, and also as much as we can at the legislature and statewide. But it's a tough consideration, right? We recognize that it is just going to be the long game.
I've found it interesting that like in this conversation, like the whole discourse about school police, like it's so important for advocates for restorative alternatives to actually practice those in these conversations. So when we're talking to folks who say, I know what I want is school police because that is what I see as the solution. And that's what makes me feel safe and seems like, you know, the right thing to me. We can't just discredit that, right? Like there's a real fear underlying that. And it's completely valid because these crises do happen. And we can hold space for that while acknowledging that it's going to be a long road of facilitating like this space for reimagining what responses can be. So it's tricky to envision something that's never happened before, right? We've almost always, you know, with society as we know it, have used police as this response, but the more and more that we see that it's actually not effective. Yeah, Andrew, you pointed that out. It's often not effective. In fact, we don't really know. The FBI data shows us that it's, I think it's been 0.2% of the time that police have even intervened in a situation like that. So if it's not what's working, maybe it is time to try something new. And so just entering into that dialogue with a really open and restorative perspective is something that I think all advocates should be aware of.
I agree with what both of you are saying, and it is a very interesting space where you are facilitating spaces that are open to various perspectives and experiences of police and schools, but also trying to cultivate an understanding of each other's experiences so that we can reimagine what schools can look like that is actually safe for all of us and not just maybe one of us who feels safe or two of us who feel safe. And so it has been interesting to say the least. And I think that that you're right. We're in it for the long haul, and there's going to be a lot of learning and sharing and discussions that hopefully will lead to action.
Perfect way to bring it home. We'll go to our last slide here. I cannot thank y'all enough, Amber and Alicia. It's been an honor. I'm coming up on 2 years at Texas Appleseed, which is surreal. 9 months we're in person at the office, a year and some change has been remote, but you know, it's all been wonderfully illuminating because I have learned so much from committed, brilliant folks like you two. And I am engaged in this consistent struggle with you, and I'm honored and cannot wait to continue in the months and years to come. So much gratitude to so many folks for this. First, to our interpreters, DJ and Cristal. Thank you for grounding us in the importance of language justice access, for interpreting today's event, and for continuing along with us during this legislative webinar series. To my wonderful colleague, all my wonderful colleagues, but especially Christian Caballero, who is just the master of all trades. Christian gets it done, has just seamlessly put together this webinar series. And I am incredibly excited for y'all to see the future ones that we have coming up. For our development team, Jamie Sauer and Miley Molin, I'm super grateful for you two and your expert coordination behind the scenes leading up to and during the webinar today. To my colleague, Vicki Sullivan, who has been with us for 2 months at Texas Appleseed, who is a senior staff attorney with the Education Justice Project. Thank you, thank you, thank you for everything. You know, I've been doing this for about 20 months, I guess full-time alone, but to have a collaborator like Vicki has just been a wonderful component of 2021. And for all the folks engaging with the legislative process right now, in community, in the public, kind of figuring out how to do it as the pandemic is still a part of our reality, and who are earnestly trying to have your voices heard at the legislature, I say continue on. We are here to support you, and we are here to offer any resources that we can individually or from our organizations to you, right? And to all the staffers who are working in the Capitol this session, as Alicia said, who have made this process a bit more seamless and allowed for the public to engage. We thank you. Please do shoot us a line over email. We have our emails listed on the slide deck, both for me, Amber, and Alicia. Please follow our organizations on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. We have all of those resources available to you on the slide deck. And we intend to send a follow-up email with the slide deck. So if you weren't able to take things down and you'd like to refer back to various links that we shared, that will be included in a follow-up email. Thank you all so much. This was incredibly wonderful, and the struggle continues.